Yo, JD here, and as you can see, we are on F122 as always, and as you can see in today's video, we have a little bit of a live comm going on here, and that's because I feel this video really does deserve that. And as you can see by the title of this video, this is a question that I probably get asked the most, more than any other question I get. And I think it's a very, very important one. And I think there's a lot of people who, especially who are new to the game or the series itself, can feel quite intimidated by, and they feel they don't know what they need to do. And that is, what do you need to do to make a time trial setup become a race setup itself? And straight away, I'm just going to say I don't really think there is such thing as a time trial setup. I think you can use a lot of time trial setups. Pretty much 90% of the time trial setups are world records or people in the top 10, top 5, and be very, very successful when it comes to playing online, playing in Grand Prix mode. When it does come to my team, I get this question a lot myself, and to be honest, my team is a very impossible question to answer because it all depends on what stage of the development you are with the car itself. If you're in Season 2 or if you're just starting out. If you're just starting out, the car is, let's be honest, completely crap. So nothing really is going to work that well on it. Using a hot lap and setup like mine or someone else's in time trial or anything like that is going to be a good baseline for you. But it really, again, depends on where you go with the development of the car. Do you go on the powertrain? Do you go with the aerodynamics? Do you go on the chassis? Depending on which direction you go in, will dictate how you actually set up the car itself. So when it comes to those questions, or when it comes to my team, that's something you will have to do a bit more trial and error yourself with. But hopefully what we discuss here today will help you that as well. And this video is actually going to be very similar to my setup explanation video, especially since I've played the game a lot more since then. I myself have got a much better understanding of it now than I did when I first started playing, obviously. And yeah, we're just going to go into time trial and we're going to run through the different components of the setup. And there are a few things I would advise people to focus on, which I think will help you quite a bit. The main one is going to be the tire pressures. That is the main thing on the set that I think is very different from what the time trial is. Because in time trial, if you don't know, it's basically a game mode where it shows people's fastest laps. And I've always said this to people who have had coaching sessions with me or people I just speak to, that always take time trial with a very, very big pinch of salt. Because obviously it does show who's fast, obviously, but when it comes to online, in the time trial, you don't have to manage your tyre wear, you don't have to manage your tyre temperatures, you don't have to manage your ERS usage or anything whatsoever. It's simply you've just thrown everything at the wall and that lap has stuck itself. Whereas online, there's a lot more things you have to manage and factor in, which is where there are some parts of the setup which I think you should focus a bit more on in order to get more out of yourself when it comes to racing online itself. So if we go into the time trial mode now, and we'll just do an example. So it doesn't matter what car, because we're not really going to be doing any laps here at all. And yeah, we'll just jump into Silverstone here and we'll download the world record setup, which is probably Mr. FRA Elite. And yeah, let's look at his setup here. So if you go through here, so he's running 16/8 wings, 60/50 differential, right, left, 1-1, 1-1, 4-4, 150, and minimum front tire pressures, and middle default rear pressures itself. And starting with the tire pressures itself, this is what I would recommend you to do. So whenever you download a time trial setup itself, or hot lap and setup, or using anyone else's setup that they've offered you or advice on or they've given to you, I would always start with minimum pressures. And for quite a few tracks, you won't have to run minimum pressures. But I think this is the number one thing that you have to change straight away. Because as I said, in time trial, this mode, it's not always representative of what your pace would be online, because you don't have to worry about tyre temperatures or tyre wear or any of the other factors at all. Whereas online, obviously, you have the tyre wear, which is just going to get worse and worse throughout the race itself. Depending on how smooth you drive and with your inputs, that's going to create a big effect on your tyre temperatures. Because the smoother you are with your inputs, the lower the temperatures will be, which could mean you could use a more aggressive setup which actually offers more grip, harder to control, but if you can control it, you go get much more from it, if that makes sense. So I would always recommend you to start with minimum pressures whenever you go to any track online. And really the sweet spot, I would say, is in the low to mid 90s. If you can achieve that consistently with your tyre temperatures, because a lot of eSport drivers, they hide their MFD, and so you can't see their differential and when they're looking at the tyre temperatures, because it is a very important thing. You really want to be aiming for mid to low 90s, and as long as you're not dipping into the hundreds or the very high 90s consistently all the time, then if you do start dipping into that, then say if your front pressures or front tyres are hitting 98 to 100 degrees consistently all the time, and you had it on maybe here, you simply lower it. Or if you were in the maybe mid 80s or high 80s and you weren't even getting into 90s on your front tyres, then just increase it by 1. If it then starts hitting 91, 92, increase it again. Then it starts hitting 95 when you put on this, then simply just keep it on that. And then you'll just have to pay attention to your rear and then apply exactly the same thing. But I'd say the big difference between TT online when it comes to setups is definitely your tyre pressures. That is really the main thing. And as I said at the start of this video, I don't really believe in a race only kind of setup so much. There are things that you can do to give yourself a better chance of the race, and it really depends on your strengths. If you're a great qualifier, then it might be more beneficial to focus on that pace and then just really try and manage your setup during the race itself. But if you're not as good as qualifying like me, then there's other things you can do to set where you're going to have better tyre wear. So if you can keep that consistency in the race, it might come back to you. But if I don't really believe that there's such thing as a time trial setup, only other than the pressures itself. But if you go through everything else, he's running 68 wings here. That's something that can work very well online. The only thing I might advise when you do come to play online is maybe have these wings a little bit closer together, because again, you don't have the effect of tyre temperatures around here or tyre wear, because when the tyres are going off and the wear's getting worse, the front can actually maybe potentially, or the rear might even be able to heat up more than the front, which then is going to make the front more responsive and it's going to create more oversteer. So having the wings closer together is going to make the front end not as pointy, a little bit more understeer, a little bit more stability, and that's actually going to reduce the tyre temperatures as well. Or another thing I'd say is maybe he's running 16.8 here. I know a lot of people now, you run 2014. So wings are a little bit closer again, but they're also a bit higher. So that's going to be better for your tyre wear in the race, because the higher downforce is going to give you better tyre wear, which is something, it's actually quite a big factor. I'm starting to notice in this game. It's something I've actually suffered with myself. Although the lower wings is great for the ERS usage, it's worse for tyre wear. And the higher wings as well, especially on the rear, is going to give you better traction, which is something you need. And it's going to heat up the tyres just that little bit quicker as well. But then it won't make it go too hot. So the only thing I'd say potentially from TT2 race is bring the wings a little bit closer together. The front still higher than the rear most of the time, but just a bit closer together, and maybe just a little bit higher, or maybe 3 to 5 clicks each. That kind of range is something you want to be aiming for. When it comes to the transmission, this again is something that very much can stay the same itself. On the on-throttle, this is something you can actually change during the race itself, but I really do think 60% is a sweet spot. A lot of people have said to me that why don't you run higher now because the traction is easier. Although the traction is a bit easier from gears 1 to 3, I still think you can actually lose the car quite easily in 4th to 5th gear. It does seem to be quite inconsistent at times itself. And basically, in a nutshell, the higher you go on the on throttle, the more traction potential you have, but the harder it is to go on the traction. So the smoother you have to be. But if you lose the car under traction, you get wheel spin or an oversteer moment. Since both wheels are now rotating more at the same speed, hence it being called 100% locked, then it's going to be harder to correct and recover that wheel spin or that oversteer moment. Whereas if it's lower, so more towards the 60 here, then although you might not get the traction potential and benefit if you're smooth on it, it's going to be much easier and much more consistent for you to be going the power, which I think with traction still being quite tricky in this game, it's something I think over the course of the race you'll get more benefit out of being more consistent on the power itself. So if you do get that oversteer moment or a little bit of wheel spin, the other side or the other wheel on the opposite side can kind of counteract itself to balance out that speed difference, and it's much easier to control the car. And especially when your tyres are going off, it's the lower you go, the better, in my opinion. But going up to 60, just so you do get a little bit of a benefit, but not too much where it's going to be more risk and more reward itself. With the off throttle, typically you can run this on 50% as well. The more towards the left, so fully over to 50%, the wheels are going to be moving much more independently from each other. So when you're in slow speed corners from gears 1, 2 to 3, and you're going off the throttle, you're off the brake, you're kind of coasting between that transition of the throttle or brake, or vice versa. One side of the car is going to be moving quicker than the other, which will give you more rotation into the corners. So if you feel in a race sometimes, like at Baku, if you watch my Baku stream, which was great, then you might have heard me say, oh, please remind me to make it from 51 to 50% off throttle. And the reason why I did that is because going up will give you more stability. So it won't give me as much rotation, so it will give me less performance, but it's going to give me much more stability, a little bit more understeer. And as the tyres go off and the car gets harder and harder to drive, it's going to be much less likely for it to over-rotate into the corner, which is something you definitely don't want around places like Baku itself. So I'd often say that the on throttle is going to be the same, and whatever you would have it in the time trial, but the off throttle might be maybe 1 to 2%, and sometimes that's all you need. I wouldn't really go higher than 56 or 55, because then I think you're just getting too much understeer. So it's all about having that performance versus risk. More performance, more risk. More performance, more risk. But they work in the opposite way. So a little bit higher on the off throttle, which I think is a very important aspect of the setup, will give you more stability in low speed corners, which will make it easier to go on the traction. Could make it so you can carry more speed as well. Again, it does depend on your driving style, but yeah, if you can be really smooth with the steering, then you could get away with a lower one, which was going to give you the performance. But if you can control it, then that's where you're going to benefit much more. But for the race, I'd maybe have this on 60-51 or 60-52 most of the time. Suspension geometry, something I just don't think you really need to change whatsoever. With the suspension, the only thing I would say, I feel, and again, this might be different for different people and for different tracks, I would always have one on the rear suspension and the rear anti-roll bar. And the reason for that, one on the rear for each of these, is going to give you the most stability on the rear. It's going to give you the most traction. It's going to be the best on tyre wear. It's actually going to give you a little bit more straight line speed as well, very, very slightly. Rear stability is very, very important in this game. And I think you do see most setups that having a little bit lower, or one on the rear anti-roll bar and suspension really works well in a race. Because sometimes in time trial, people will have maybe like this, maybe like 7.4 or 6.5 or something like that. When it comes to online, I would probably maybe just put it simply like this itself. And the changes in this game are not as sensitive as they were in previous games, but this just gives you so much more rear stability. And when your tyres go off, and the temperatures are definitely a lot more of a factor now online or in Grand Prix mode or even my team, then I would always have the rear suspension and rear anti-roll bar always on 1. And with the front suspension, having that on 1 as well definitely seems to work, especially with the curbs and the traction. If your front end is a little bit too twitchy as you're turning into the corner, instead of maybe adjusting the aero, just increasing this maybe anywhere from 1 to 6. The higher you go, the more stability you have when turning into the corners. And then with the roll bar, if it's during the corner, so like Maggots and Beckett's, you're turning that left flat out and then it's that right flat out, then if the car is getting away from you during the corner, it's not on the entry but during the corner, then simply increase the front anti-roll bar. And that's all you really need to do. So quite often I've actually used quadruple 1 for a lot of my setups now as well. But sometimes I think maybe going anywhere from 1 to 6 on the front, depending on how much more stable you want it to be, but always having 1 on the rear suspension and roll bar, I think is definitely a must for online itself. As for the ride height, this again is very much of a preference. I believe the ride heights that people use in time trial, again, work very, very well online itself. This is something I wouldn't really change that much. Quite often 4.4, 4.5 is going to give you even a little bit more stability itself. Some people run 5.4, so that's going to give you a little bit better straight line speed, a little bit more of twitchiness in the car, so a little bit more responsive itself. But I do find 4.5 to be a very good sweet spot. Enough clearance where it's going to be good over the curbs. It's going to give you good traction as well. I do think it's gone of the days where we're running 2.7 like we did on the previous games, where the bigger the space, the more stability it was. I think you can get away with 4.5 or 5.4 if you want a bit more straight line speed but less in the corners, or you want a bit more stability in the corners but lower straight line speed. Then maybe a 4.5 could work for you. With the brakes, 150%. Sometimes you can run 51% in the race as your tyres are getting away from you. So you could either do this, or you could go to the off throttle and change that between qualifying and the race, because this is something you can change in Parc Fermé. But obviously during the race, you can't change the off throttle. So you might want to just slowly increase the front brake bias, which has a very similar effect where it stops the rears from locking and the rear of the car from over-rotating going into a corner itself. But most of the time, this is going to be 150%. And as we said, with the tyre pressures, in a time trial, you can get away with running maximum. Tyre temperatures and tyre wear are not a factor. You have the same level of grip all the time. Doesn't matter how aggressive you are, it's not going to upset the car from a temperature-wise at all. But online, I'd always start from minimum as a baseline, and then simply work your way up until you get into the low to mid-90s consistently on each tyre itself. So hopefully that was a little bit of an explanation. The only things I would really actually consider is just increasing the aero, making the wings a bit closer together as well, potentially increasing the off throttle between the qualifying and the race itself, because the race, as your tyres get more and more warm, the rear does become a bit more looser, so that's something you could do. So in low speed corners, more stability, higher off diff. Geometry, it's always the same. with this, the rear suspension and the rear anti-roll bar, so second and fourth option, I would always have that on one, to protect your tyres, give you the best traction, the best stability on the rear. The front part is really up to you. The lower you go down on the front, the more rotation you'll have on the front. But if you feel it's a little bit unstable on the front end, turning into the corners, increase. During the corners, increase. 4.5, 4.4, 5.5, 5.4, I think are very good baseline ride heights to run. Same for the brakes, and what we just said to the tyre pressures. So definitely online in my team and Grand Prix mode, always start from minimum. And I think this is the one thing that you have to change, is definitely the tyre pressures. Other than that, I would say sometimes there is no difference between the two. There really is no such thing. So yeah, I hope that has somewhat answered some of your questions. I'm sorry if it's a little bit of a different kind of video. Hopefully this helps you out and you appreciate it. Give it a thumbs up if you have. Make sure if you go to coachlimitless.com, I have many more sessions in September onwards, because August they have all been taken. So thank you very much for your support on that. Make sure you sign up to Bybit in the link down in the description. And yeah, I will be catching you very soon. Peace.